John.
Yes. How are you?
How's it going? How are you?
Good. I myself and Shoshana.
Hello.
Hello.
It's nice to see you.
Uh-oh, I'm trying to remember your first name.
Shoshana.
Shoshana, right? Your husband just said, perhaps I didn't hear.
That's okay. That's okay.
Good morning. It's 10 o'clock by you, right?
Yes,
Yes.
exactly.
We're finishing our breakfast on a very relaxed Sunday morning.
Yes.
One of the joys of coronavirus, the few joys, is we have more time to relax and be with each other.
There's no pressure.
Yes, yes, yes. I see that Sergio has joined us.
Yes.
Nobody's-
Hello.
Hello, is that the Sergio, a member from Colorado?
No, I'm a friend of Yael Groner who's called from France.
Ah, nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
So let's see, what I want to do is to put on the screen the source sheet,
Mhm.
which I'm going to do right now. Okay. Share screen. Here we go. Share. So if I did a good job,
You did a good job.
okay, that's good.
If you could make it a little larger. Rabbi Hanan, if you could make it a little larger.
Yeah, I think I can. You know what? I'm using here a new word, a new,
If you go down to the bottom of your screen, and
I
you see
see,
that
yeah.
thing is 100, you can make that a little bigger. That's a little too much.
Okay.
That looks good.
That looks perfect.
Okay, I could even
Thank
make
you.
it bigger, I
That's
guess. Wait a second.
House of Thrones. He's
Il y a
outside.
l'image du coup, la photo des gens.
Look at that. You're an expert.
Wow.
Is that, oh, I see Jeff from China joining us, right?
Yes, hi, Hanan. Hi. Hi, folks.
Hey, Jeff, and I see Esther.
What did I do? I changed it to something.
Who's speaking?
Non. Merci.
And I see Taylor, but I think that's a last name, right? Not a first name.
Yeah, my first name's Myra.
Hello, nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Hi, Rabbi Schlesinger. It's Mary Beth.
Mary Beth, hello. I don't see you on my screen.
I know I'm behind Myra. It turns out I have to work today, but it's very nice to hear your voice.
Nice to hear your voice. And I see also someone that I think I recognize, but I don't remember. How can I identify you?
That is Ellen Cohen from New Haven, Connecticut.
The person who just waved?
Yes. At
Ellen.
dinner at their house.
Hi.
Her husband is Stephen Fraud.
Yes, yes.
Yes, you and Shadi were at our house.
And you're Ellen Cohen.
I'm Ellen Cohen.
So I know someone else by the same name.
Take a seat.
There are many of us.
I know you can make us a black one.
And I see Saskia. Saskia Keeley, who's about to do a webinar herself another 2 hours, I think. But Saskia can't hear me.
Hi. My webinar is tomorrow.
Someone just waved and I don't know who that is. I don't remember.
Ben Malov.
Ben, that's Ben, right? That's Ben.
Yeah.
I used to be able to click on this and I could make it.
So you know what? Before we start, it might be a good idea if everyone wrote in the chat box just one sentence or half a sentence who you are. You can say hello to everyone. And I'm gonna try and access the chat box
It had something to do with this mute thing. Thing came, David.
You don't have to, of course, but anyone who wants to tell us who they are. I don't know many of you. Oh, I see that Judy Lerner, my cousin, is with us.
Hi, hello. Hi.
Yes, Judy, I see you.
Hi, nice to see you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. My brother Paul told me he so much enjoyed your class, so I'm taking it too. Thank you.
Great. And I see Ilana.
Hello, Rav Schlesinger.
Hi, Ilana.
Hello.
Okay, I guess we can begin. Oh, I see Audrey from Albany.
Good morning.
Good morning to you.
Or afternoon for you, I suppose.
Yeah, it's almost evening. Oh, and I see Maggie from Virginia. I'm just looking. Oh, and I see Moshe from Beersheba.
Do you want the earphones?
Hi, Hanan.
Moshe, nice to see you. Okay, so we can start. So for those of you who don't know, let's start by this. Anyone who's
I'm here so that you can watch it.
Anyone who's in a completely quiet room can leave themselves unmuted.
Yeah,
if
no,
you're
I'm fine.
with some background noise, then please mute yourself. And if you
Hanan?
Yes.
I think it'd be best if everybody muted themselves until it's question times.
Okay. That's good. And then someone who feels they want to unmute themselves because their room is completely quiet. I think that's allowable. It's good to start your right muted. Okay. So I'll introduce myself. My name is Hanan Schlesinger. I've been a rabbi my whole life, teaching in different institutions of Jewish learning in Jerusalem and in Gush Etzion, south of Jerusalem, later 2 years in Florida, and then recently about 7 or 8 years in Dallas, Texas. I came back home to Israel from Dallas in about 2013 or 2014. And since 2014, I've been one of the directors of Shorashim. In Arabic, that's Judur, and Hebrew, it's Roots, the Israeli-Palestinian grassroots initiative for understanding nonviolence and transformation. I was one of the founders of Roots in January 2014. Everything we're going to study about today is about Passover, but the subtext is Roots. The subtext is my personal experience with my other, my Palestinian other, the person, the neighbor, the people who are considered by my Jewish Israeli neighbors to be the enemy. I discovered them as human beings 6 years ago, and much of the way I see the world and I see Judaism and see myself is filtered through the lens of my very, very powerful experience of meeting the enemy and learning that he or she is a human being just like me. So that's the subtext. I'll try and stop every 5 or 10 minutes to allow questions. You can raise your hand or you can put it in the chat box. I'll try and look in the chat box if you're asking questions. But I also can see everyone on the screen. So we will begin by taking less than 5 minutes to tell the backstory of Passover, something that most Jews know, but some of you may not know. I'm going to say nothing new and nothing exciting in these first 5 minutes. So very briefly, the first book of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, is Genesis. And at the end of Genesis, we find the Israelites going down from the land of Canaan, the land of Israel, to Egypt because of a famine. There's 70 of them. They're the children and grandchildren of Jacob the patriarch. And when they go down to Egypt, the Torah, the text of the book of Genesis, makes it very clear to us that they're going down lagor, the Hebrew word lagor, which means to live temporarily. An English word I sometimes use to translate that is to sojourn. And there is a Hebrew word, a noun, that comes from that verb, ger. A ger is a sojourner, someone who comes to a foreign land temporarily. He may stay for a while, but he or she always sees himself as someone who's not from that place. So again, the ger, the sojourner, the foreigner who comes to stay for a while. The Israelites are defined in Egypt as coming legor, to sojourn, and they are gerim. Gerim is the plural of ger. They are sojourners. They are temporary foreign residents. So they live in Egypt quite well. They're accepted and taken under the wing of the ruler of Paro. But the Torah tells us at the end of the book of Genesis and the beginning of the book of Exodus that they multiply very quickly and very to quite a degree, and they arouse the suspicion of Paro, of the leader of Egypt, and of the people who are afraid of them. And eventually the Egyptians feel that they have to try and do something about the overpopulation of the Israelites. They begin to persecute them and throw the first male children into the sea, into the river. And eventually they are put into a situation of slavery. They become slaves. Then we're told that God hears the groaning and the pain of the slaves, of the Israelite slaves, who become a multitude of 600,000. God appoints Moses and Aaron to save the slaves from Egypt, to redeem them. And then eventually, on a night that is defined in the Jewish calendar as between the 14th and the 15th of the Hebrew month of Nisan, they are redeemed. They're taken out of Egypt. They go to the Red Sea. The sea is crossed. The Egyptians are killed. They go to freedom. That night between the 14th and 15th of the Hebrew month of Nisan was 4 nights ago in our celebration 3,000 years later. The night that they left is called Passover, Pesach, which we Jews celebrate every year in the Passover Seder, Seder Leil HaPesach. And we should just know that there are actually 2 holidays that begin on that night between the 14th and 15th of the Hebrew month of Nisan. The holiday of Passover is, according to the Bible, a 12-hour holiday. It's just that night. And that same holiday begins a 7-day holiday, that we call the holiday of unleavened bread, the holiday of matzah. Today we blur the difference between the two. We usually call the whole 7 days the holiday of Passover. I should also mention that there is a command in the Torah that a Jew every day of their life should remember the Exodus from Egypt. But secondly, there's a special commandment to remember that Exodus on the night that it happened, again, the night between the 14th and the 15th of the Hebrew month of Nisan, which was 4 nights ago, Wednesday night. And the Jews around the world sat down to their Passover Seder to remember. Now, that's the background. Most Jews also know that the central experience of Jews, the central historical memory, is the memory of the slavery in Egypt and the experience of the redemption. We're commanded to remember those 2 things, the slavery and the freedom. We're commanded again and again and again to remember, to remember, to remember. And the question that we begin our class with today is why? What's the purpose of remembering? What's the reason? What's the goal? And I believe that the answer to that question is a no-brainer. I believe it's written about 36 times in the Torah, that there's really nothing to discuss. It's obvious. And it's kind of ironic in our day that Jews that you would call liberal, who are reform or are reconstructionist or renewal or conservative, most Jews of those streams know the answer to the question. Why are we commanded to remember the slavery and the freedom? But ironically, those Jews who consider themselves to be most dedicated to Judaism, most religious, the Orthodox, they're the ones who for some reason have a problem remembering why we remember. So be that as it may, we're just going to now take half an hour, which is a rather long amount of time, to look at verses in the Torah that answer this question. Why are we supposed to remember? And I'm going to say really nothing extraordinary in this half hour of our class. I hope that later I'll say something extraordinary, but not now. And I'll just, together with you, read the verses that say the same thing again and again and again, answering the question why it's so important and what is the goal and mission, the purpose of remembering that we were slaves in Egypt and that God took us out from slavery to freedom. Before we begin, does anyone want to comment or ask? No. So we'll just read from the source sheet. I put the source sheet on the screen. Anyone not see the source sheet? I guess everyone has it. John says he has it. That's good. And anyone who wants it as a Word document and didn't get it from me can email me after the class and I can send it to you. So here we go. We're going to read a number of verses. I divided them into categories. I separated them by a dotted line. The first verse is in a category by itself and actually doesn't answer the question of why we're supposed to remember, but it's just an introduction for my purposes. The verse is Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 9. And it says, "You shall not abhor an Egyptian, for you were a sojourner in his land." You were a ger in his land. Here I just want to point out with this verse that the verse could have said many other things that it doesn't say. It could have said, "You shall not love an Egyptian because you were sojourners in his land and they did terrible things to you." It could have said, "You must hate an Egyptian. You must take revenge against Egyptians. You should never let Egyptians into your life, into your community because of the terrible things they did." And all that it doesn't say. It says the opposite. "You shall not abhor an Egyptian if you are a sojourner in his land." Now, what does that mean? Now, I understand that for many years before the Israelites were made slaves and were persecuted in Egypt, they were sojourners there who were treated nicely. So perhaps the verse is saying, forget about the bad things the Egyptians did to you. Only remember the good things. Don't abhor an Egyptian because they welcomed you into their land as sojourners, and what they did to you afterwards is not to be taken into account. In other words, look at the glass as half full and not half empty. Whatever, it's an interesting verse, and it really is in a certain sense counterintuitive. Just remember the good and not remember the bad. Give thanks and treat nicely the Egyptians because of the good things they did for you, and about the bad things, we'll not talk about that. Let's go on to Deuteronomy chapter 24, the first of the verses that tell us why we should remember. "When you reap the harvest in your field and overlook a sheaf in the field, do not turn back to get it. It shall go to the sojourner," that's our word, the ger, "the fatherless and the widow, in order that the Lord your God may bless you in all your undertakings. When you beat down the fruit of your olive trees, do not go over them again. That shall go to the sojourner, the ger, the fatherless and the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, do not pick it over again. Then that shall go to the sojourner, the ger, the fatherless and the widow." So in other words, when you're farming in your field, and when you are harvesting and you harvest the vineyard, you harvest the olive, you harvest the wheat, the grain, collect your crop once and don't go back to pick up all the things you didn't get the first time. The grapes that you missed, the olives that you missed, the sheaves of wheat that you missed, leave that in the field so that those who are less fortunate than you, who don't own land, can come after you and glean. It's described very nicely in the book of Ruth that talks about this poor Moabite woman who comes to the fields of the Israelites in Bethlehem and gleans after the harvesters. All these people who you're supposed to allow to glean, the sojourner, the ger, the fatherless, and the widow, they're all people who don't have land. They don't have a strong social network. Their relatives are dead. They don't have people who can support them. They don't have friends and family. You support them. And what's the reason? Here we get to verse 22, after we read 19, 20, 21. Verse 22 says, "Always remember that you were slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore do I enjoin you to observe this commandment." So it looks pretty simple. We remember what happened to us. We were treated badly. We know how it feels when we were slaves in Egypt. And now that there are people in your society who are not well off, who don't have means to support themselves, well, you don't do to them as was done to you when you were in their shoes, but rather do to them as you would have want done to you when you were in this situation of being a second-class citizen, of not having land, of not having a support system, not having what to eat. Behave nicely because you remember what it's like, apparently. It's what we call, in modern language, empathy. That's what it looks like. Let's read now the book of Exodus, chapter 22, verse 20. And you shall not mistreat a sojourner, that same word ger, nor shall you oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. Again, seems like because of my experience in Egypt a number of years ago, from me and us 3,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, it happened only 1,000 years ago. Because you know what it's like, you know how it feels, you've been in that situation. When someone is in that situation that you were in and you suffered, don't make them suffer as you suffered. Don't behave towards him as the Egyptians behaved towards you. Remember what it was like. Then we get to Leviticus chapter 19, verses 33 and 34. When a sojourner sojourns with you in your land, you shall not oppress him. Just like we saw in Exodus. The sojourner who sojourns with you shall be as a native from among you, and you shall love him as yourself. For you were sojourners in the land of Egypt, I'm Lord your God. That's pretty strong language. Love him as yourself. I understand that I should love people who are like me, like myself, my neighbors and my co-religionists, people who go to the same synagogue as me, people who speak my language, people who are born in the same land as me. Then perhaps I can love them. But I should love, so the verse says, people who are not like me. That is to say, they're not like me today. They're like I was 3,000 years ago. People who are in the same situation as I was 3,000 years ago, love him as yourself. And again, it seems to be talking about empathy, at putting yourself in his or her shoes, but being able to go back in time, remember how it feels, seeing yourself in them and behaving towards him or her as you would have wanted others to behave towards you when you were suffering, back when you were gerim, when you were the other, the sojourner in the land of Egypt. That's difficult to do, but that's what it says. And then we get to Deuteronomy chapter 10. For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great, mighty, and awesome God, who will show no favor, nor will he take a bribe. He executes the judgment of the orphan and widow, and he loves the sojourner. To give him bread and clothing, you shall love the sojourner, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. So here it says again that you should love the sojourner, just like we read earlier. And it says that God loves the sojourner. So you should do like God, you should be like God, you should follow in God's footsteps, which is, by the way, a commandment someplace else in the Torah that says, act like God. But the memory of being a sojourner in Egypt so many years ago is what allows me to act like God. I can love the sojourner because I put myself in his shoes because I remember what it was like. So the historical memory of the experience in Egypt allows me to fulfill the commandment of being like God and loving the sojourner like him or her. And then we get to Exodus chapter 23. And you shall not oppress a sojourner, for you know the feelings of the sojourner, since you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. That phrase that says you know the feelings of the sojourner, in Hebrew, a literal translation is, you know the soul of the sojourner. You have the same feelings as him because you were there, because you were sojourners. That's really the biblical equivalent of the modern concept of empathy. Then verse 10, 11, and 12 go on to say, 6 years you may sow your land and gather in its produce. But in the 7th year, what we call the sabbatical year, the year of release, you shall release it and abandon it. In other words, we work the field 6 years, the 7th year, in what's called the sabbatical cycle, we're not supposed to work the land, just leave it fallow, whatever grows, grows. And then the land that you own is no more yours than it is the whole people. Anyone can come and take from the produce that grows naturally. The poor of your people shall eat it. and what they leave over, the beasts of the field shall eat. So you shall do to your vineyard and to your olive trees. So notice that this matter of leaving the fields fallow once every 7 years and not having, and me who owns it, not having more access to the produce of the field that grows naturally than anyone else, that's in the context of knowing the feelings of the sojourner. In other words, once every 7 years, we go back to a situation in which the sojourner is no less better off than I am. We have an equalization. Owning property and not being a sojourner, being a citizen means nothing. Once every 7 years, we equalize things because you know what it's like to be in his shoes. And then verse 12, in the same chapter, 6 days you may do your work, but on the 7th day you shall rest. That's the Sabbath, Shabbat. In order that your ox and your donkey shall rest, and your maidservants and the sojourner shall be refreshed. Notice, why did Jews refrain from not working on the 7th day? Not for our own benefit, but so that if we don't work, we won't have work to give the sojourner. So the purpose is that the sojourner doesn't work. He has to rest, and the way to get him to rest is for us to rest. So we rest so he can rest, and this all goes back to, you remember what it's like since you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. This is, of course, not the only rationale given for the Sabbath. Other verses give other reasons, but here we have this reason. After all those verses, I have there a dotted line, which means we're reading now, beginning at this moment, verses that are slightly different, go in a slightly different direction. Deuteronomy chapter 5 says, keep the Sabbath day to sanctify it, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days shall you work and do all your creative labor. But the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall do no creative labor, neither you, your son, your daughter, your manservant, your maidservant, your ox, your donkey, any of your livestock, nor the sojourner who is within your cities, in order that your maidservant and your maidservant may rest like you. And you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and that the Lord your God took you out from there with a strong hand, with an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. So notice we have here, we're talking about the Sabbath like we did 2 minutes ago. And we're talking about the fact that the downtrodden, the sojourner, and the maidservant, the manservant should rest. And it's connected to the memory of Egypt, but it's very different. What's different? The early verses we saw say that you should let your sojourner rest on the 7th day because you remember what it's like to be a sojourner. But these verses say you should let your sojourner rest on the 7th day because God redeemed you from work, so you should redeem him from work. God redeemed you from Egyptian slavery, and you should redeem him from his downtrodden nature once every 7 days. So it's the same circumstances, the same Sabbath, the same sojourner, the same result, but it's given a different rationale. Up until now, until 2 minutes ago, all the verses we saw were about behaving nicely towards the other, towards the sojourner, because remember what it's like. Now the verses are saying, remember to behave nicely towards the sojourner, not because you remember what it's like, but because you want to act like God. God freed you, so you free him. Now Deuteronomy chapter 15, going in the same direction. If a fellow Hebrew man or woman is sold to you, he shall serve you 6 years, and in the 7th year you shall set him free. When you set him free, do not let him go empty-handed. Furnish him out of the flock, threshing floor, and vat with which the Lord your God has blessed you. Bear in mind that you were slaves, land of Egypt, from Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore, I enjoin this commandment upon you today. Same thing we saw earlier. God redeemed the slaves, which I was. Therefore, you redeem your slaves. God redeemed the slaves in Egypt time, brought them from slavery to freedom. So if you have a slave, if you have a slave sold to you, redeem him also. Not immediately after 6 years of servitude, you redeem him. And by the way, when it says in verse 13, do not let him go empty-handed, that's reminiscent of what we read in the book of Exodus, that when the Israelites left Egyptian slavery, they were furnished amply with going away gifts at God's command by the Egyptians. So just as God arranged it that the slaves in Egypt, the Israelites, so many thousands of years ago, were redeemed with a going away gift, so when you redeem your slave in order to follow in God's footsteps and redeem as God redeemed, you do the same thing. You also give him a going away gift. That's why you remember that you were redeemed from Egyptian slavery so that you know how to behave towards slaves in your day. And then Deuteronomy chapter 24. You shall not subvert the rights of the sojourner, the ger, or the fatherless. You shall not take a widow's garment in pawn. Remember that you were a slave in Egypt and that the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore do I enjoin you to observe this commandment. Same thing again. God redeemed you, so you redeem him. God brought you from slavery to freedom. God gave you more than you had as a downtrodden, persecuted Israelite. Therefore, you do the same for the fatherless and the sojourner and the widow in your day. Behave well towards them and redeem them as God redeemed you. Many point out, I'm summarizing now, that there's no other commandment, no other matter in the Torah that the Torah repeats so many times as it does this matter, proper behavior towards the ger, the sojourner, 36 times altogether, according to one count. That's a lot. The Torah doesn't often repeat itself. So everything we saw is really clear. It's simple. It's straightforward. It's not hidden. It's written again and again and again. It's repeated. We remember in order to behave towards others differently than what was done to us by the Egyptians. And we remember in order to redeem our slaves and our downtrodden and our sojourners as God redeemed us. It's totally clear. And therefore it seems simple that when we Jews sit down to the Passover Seder once a year, and remember being slaves and being brought out to freedom, it seems clear that the purpose of it, the purpose of the experience of the Seder, is in order to fill our consciousnesses and our conscious with this experience so that we do what it says, so that we know how to behave properly in our day. For all the reasons we saw, it's totally clear. It's simple. There's nothing to say. Now, I want to take just 5 minutes to briefly deal with the question, who is the sojourner in our day? Who is it? And to me, the answer to that question is also apparently obvious. Who is the sojourner? The sojourner is the person who is in a circumstance today like I was in Egypt 3,000 years ago. And that's what the Torah says. You were sojourners, you were gerim. Remember what it was like, and therefore behave differently towards the sojourner in your day. So which sojourner in your days are talking about? The one who's in the same shoes, the same situation as you were back in Egypt. So who is it? Well, we were Israelites in Egypt. We weren't Egyptians. We were there for a while. We weren't just passing through. We weren't just there for 1 day or 2 days or 5 days. We were there for a long time, a year, 5 years, 10 years, 100 years. So we're pretty set in the land. That's who the sojourner is. And nowadays, it's not just someone who's here today, gone tomorrow. It's not just a businessman coming from Japan or Korea. It's someone who's been in the land. But on the other hand, someone who's not part of the culture. He's an outsider. He's an other. It's someone who doesn't have a support system. It's someone who doesn't have land. Someone who feels himself to be an outsider. And also, remember that in Egypt, we were feared by the Egyptians. They were afraid we might take over their land. So it means that the other who comes from a foreign land, even if you're afraid of him, he's still a sojourner, he's still a ger. He's still the person who you're supposed to take care of. So who is it in our day? Well, if you're in America, it's clear. It's blacks, it's Puerto Ricans, it's Hispanics, it's anyone who seemed to be another, anyone who's a little bit an outsider, anyone who's come, is not just passing through as a businessman, but is settled down for a year or 2, 3, but doesn't have a social safety net, who's a little bit feared by the society. He's your ger, he's your other, he's your sojourner. Who is it in Israel? It's foreign workers, it's asylum seekers, whether Eritrean or Nigerian, and it's also Palestinians, someone who we see as the other. I would say, the Palestinians are the enemy, they're feared. Well, yes, in Egypt, the Israelites were the enemy, they were feared, but that didn't make him less of a sojourner. The Torah says that we should behave properly towards the sojourner, towards the other. So it seems pretty clear to me. Now, it's certainly true that in Jewish legal literature, halachic literature, the rabbis have many different discussions, and they talk about different levels of ger. Different levels. We have what, I won't go into it now, ger toshav, ger tzedek. And it's true that many Jews today, when they hear the word ger, they think of a convert. In Hebrew, we call a ger tzedek. And everyone knows you should behave properly towards the convert. But the simple meaning of the verses we read is that the convert is certainly a ger, but he's not the only ger. Even someone who didn't convert, but he's still living in our society as an outsider feared, different, weak, without a social safety net. He's your ger, and it would seem that everything we've talked about refers to him or her. So at this point, we finished the simple stuff and we're ready to begin. Everyone can take a 5-second break to rest, to think, perhaps ask a question, make a comment. Ben wants to say something.
Yeah, well, just a few thoughts, if that's okay.
Of course.
Yeah, okay. First of all, in terms of you shall not abhor the Egyptians, this is also the theme, of course, of, I think, when, the Egyptians were drowned in the sea, the army. God says, blessed be my people Egypt, and you shall not rejoice. And we only say Hallel, half a Hallel on the, on Pesach. But on the other side of things, it seems to me that your interpretation of, the whole, unless I, misconstrued it, of the reason for the Seder is to remember that we shall not oppress the other. I think it's a bit forced. I mean, that it's certainly a worthy conclusion, but it's not the only. It's a meal. It's a banquet of freedom. The idea of slavery into freedom inspired many movements, the Black movement, etc. And they weren't talking about, well, we should treat others as others who may have been in the area of slavery. That can be a consequence, but we've gotten inspiration. And then the third element is Rashi, I believe, says very clearly when he talks about ger, what is ger? He says exactly as you described it, someone who is not in the, is not part of your country, not just a convert. But then finally, Palestinians are not saying that, oh, we want to be, on the right to the land as well, or part of the land. So
I missed half a phrase. The Palestinians are?
Not just asking to be treated, with dignity as human beings. They're also, talking about their particular tie to the land, etc. So I wonder if there are verses in the Torah that can accommodate that as well, or interpretation of the Torah.
I see no reason, to begin with the last thing you said, why Palestinian self-understanding should affect my understanding of my relationship to him. You know, I think I have to do what the Torah says concerning the ger. To me, it's pretty simple. I'm gonna look at what Esther wrote. Okay, Esther wrote something for later, for after the class. I'm just going to think, Ben, if there's anything I should respond. Let me tell everyone who Ben is. Ben Molev is a professor at Bar-Ilan University who deals extensively with conflict resolution. And Ben has conducted a study of the work that we do in Roots recently and has written about it.
Right. So I identify definitely with what Roots stands for, but I'm also looking for sources within the Torah.
Yeah.
Can I add something to this?
Yes, of course.
Hi, Stephen. A couple of the psukim that you mentioned go on to say in various language, mishpat echad, Torah echad, chok echad, that there's to be one law, one system of law for the citizen, and one for the ger. This is in particular relation to the ger wanting to participate in the Pesach sacrifice. But that language has always struck me as very strong, because we would tend to think, we alone are the covenantal partners, the law at Sinai. Yet several times the Torah says, no, there's to be one system of justice, one system of law. Of course, it raises all sorts of questions of the ger having to circumcise himself in terms of being able to participate in the Pesach Seder. But there's a kind of sense of legal equality, and often the ger in any society is often limited by being subject to a set of laws that are different than the laws to which the native or the citizen is subject. And I just had one other thing, the pasuk from Exodus, which you correctly say.
Let me relate to what you just said.
Yeah, okay, go ahead. Yeah.
This begins to get complicated. The verse that repeats itself a number of times that I didn't bring, that says there should be one law for the ger and for the citizen. There are many who take that verse to say that yes, even the sojourner who's not a citizen deserves equality under the law, the civil law, not the religious law. That's how many interpret it. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs talks about that a lot. The Torah was the first to come up with the idea of equality under the law for both the native born and for the foreigner, the sojourner. And that's a possible reading. Another possible reading goes to the verse you mentioned that talks about the fact that there may be a sojourner who wants to be part of the ceremony of the sacrificial lamb. Now that verse is about the sojourner who wants to be part of the ceremony of the sacrificial lamb and therefore has to circumcise himself. It seems that is the set of verses that begin to establish the possibility that there are two different levels of ger. There's the regular ger, and then there's the ger who wants to become part of your people, who wants to become a citizen. In other words, he wants to convert. What that means in modern terms, he wants to become a citizen, and he can become a citizen. And once he becomes a citizen, he's another level of ger. And it may be that the verses that talk about one law for the ger and the citizen, they're only talking about that type of ger, the one who wanted to become a citizen and does what he needs to become a citizen. And that's why the rabbis later talked about two types of ger, the ger toshav, which is the one I've been talking about, and the ger tzedek, which we call a convert. So that gets complicated. But I would like to put all that aside because I think there's no doubt that all, or at least most of the verses I quoted, are not talking about the special type of ger who becomes a citizen, but the ger who is like you were in Egypt. Not a citizen, he's still a ger, he's still an outsider, he's still a sojourner. He's intending someday to go back to his land, but he still deserves all the protections under the law and all the love and empathy that the Torah talks about. But it does get complicated, I admit. You want to make a second point?
One other quick comment is, I think the pasuk which says "Ki atem yadatem et nefesh hager," which the JPS I think translates as "you know the feelings of the sojourner," and I think you correctly said that it's stronger than that. That it's nefesh. It's not just feelings. I mean, when I hear that pasuk, I think you know in your kishnas what it's like to be a ger, or it's somehow that it's our DNA is it's kind of inscribed in us. It's not just sympathy, it's empathy. You really know in your innermost parts what it means to be a ger, and I think that's not conveyed often by the translations that you know the feelings. Yes, it is feelings, but it's more than that. I think yadatim nefesh hager is you really know in your innermost parts what it means to be a ger. This is not just some circumstantial similarities that you have.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'd like to say something.
Yes.
Just following from what Ben said, also, I mean, obviously all of us here are 100% with you what root stands for, but in terms of finding basis in the Torah, also, I mean, this thing about Palestinians as ger, I mean, I think when we translate it, sometimes it's translated into English as stranger, which is a much more expansive thing. It's one not like you. But if we're saying ger is one who is a temporary sojourner in the land, clearly like for asylum seekers, that's a ger, or in the US for migrants and refugees and so forth. But I don't know. I do think we may need to find a way to, I mean, the rabbis then, they expanded on whatever a verse meant for them and said, so I think we expand on it today, because to map it exactly, to me, it doesn't fit. I think the Palestinian self-definition is important. I mean, it's so important to them. How can we say, well, that's not important? I mean, I'm not trying to tell you anything. You do such marvelous work. I mean, you know, far more than I've ever done. But I'm just saying maybe some of it is an expansion of the definition for today.
I hear. I want to respond to it, and someone else has their hand up, but just let me respond a little bit. Wait,
It's Judy.
Judy.
Would you like me to wait? It's for you to
wait a second.
Sure.
Just want to respond to, what was your name, the person who just spoke?
Michelle.
Michelle. I can't think of any reason why someone, talking about the Palestinians, who is our other in the land we see as our land, I can't see any reason why it wouldn't fall into the Torah's categories of ger. And by the way, there's a verse in the book of Ezekiel that supports what I'm saying, but anyone who wants to know what the verse is, I'll just go to I just added to the source sheet a few minutes ago, so you guys probably don't have it, but the verse in Ezekiel, is chapter 47, verse 21 to 23, if you're interested.
Can you say it?
I can't, no. Just make a note, 47, 21 to 23.
Okay.
So anyway, I can't think of any reason why not. Although I agree, there could be discussion. There should be a discussion. But I also want to say that halachically, according to Jewish law, this category of ger, according to 98% of the legal authorities, say that Muslims are in the category of ger. The reason is because they worship the same God we worship, and they accept the 7 commandments of the Noahides, which again, I don't want to go into. It's a whole nother presentation. I'm just saying that in parentheses for now, because we haven't yet gotten to the meat of our presentation today. So Judy wanted to say something. Judy Lerner, who's my cousin.
Yes. Yes, hi, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much. I just wanted to add that if we look at the narrative of the Brit with Abraham and God, there already, as if it's a condition, we're promised the land of Canaan, but first we are going to go through the experience of being avadim. And after, only after, why else was that in that Brit? But to give us the experience of being a ger and being oppressed, and then afterwards, after assimilating that feeling in our hearts, we then are given the land, and then in the position of power to somehow, in this wonderful challenge of being in power, to still have that collective memory and vicarious experience, which is then transformed into an empathy, to be as a nation, sedentary, not a ger, permanent residents, to still have that justice. And that is why we go through. So why else would that be in the narrative, but to get that experience before coming to the position of power? So then we can implement the justice.
I agree with you. I think that the book of Genesis presents that as the divine plan.
Right. So I agree with you.
It can't be proven from the text, but I think it's the case.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I believe that were we to stop here, we would be doing a great disservice to Judaism. I think that we have to come face to face with the fact that it looks like the Jewish people haven't done a very good job in fulfilling the beautiful things that we've talked about.
That's right.
Not 1,000 years ago, and not 100 years ago, and not yesterday, not today. Now, it may be we've done an okay job. It may be, I'm not sure, we've done a better job than some other nations in the way we behave towards our other. It may be, it may not be, I don't know. But certainly, given that the Torah talks about the things we learned 36 times, more than any other commandment, you would think that this would be the focus of all of Judaism. We'd be completely driven by these commandments, but we're not. And even when we do talk about it and think about it, we're not always successful. And I think that we have to grapple with that. That's really the purpose of this presentation today, to grapple with why is it so hard? So to begin with, it is hard. The Torah wouldn't say it so many times if it wasn't hard. It's not only hard, it's counterintuitive. And it goes against, so I've heard, against many basic laws of psychology. In a certain sense, it goes against human nature. The Torah is telling us to do something extremely difficult. And what I tried to do, as I thought about these things in the past when I was preparing this class, was to try and categorize why is it so hard? Why are we very often unsuccessful on the individual level and on the communal level and the national level? And I classified the difficulties, the stumbling blocks, into 3 different categories. And I'd like to talk a little bit about these 3 categories and the different subcategories within them. I hope someday in my life to actually go through all these categories and talk not about only the difficulties in these categories, but how we overcome in each category and subcategory, how we overcome the difficulties. And as a little bit of a subtext or a hint, I'd like to say that I see the work that I do in Roots, in creating reconciliation between Israelis and Palestinians. I see it really as an effort to fulfill these biblical commandments and to overcome all of the stumbling blocks, or some of the stumbling blocks that we're putting on the board, on the screen right now. if we don't deal with the stumbling blocks and just have a nice class about these beautiful commandments and then go home, we haven't accomplished anything, because we won't be able to fulfill it unless we deal with the reasons why we very often don't fulfill it. So here we go. The first
Thank
thing.
you.
So the categories of difficulty are psychological, theological, and socio-political. So here in the psychological difficulties, the first matter I wrote on the screen is fear of the unfamiliar other. Now that difficulty holds true even when you haven't been a slave in the past, you haven't been a sojourner, you haven't been a victim, you haven't been persecuted, but just you're a normal human being who's had a good life, and you have a foreigner, you have a sojourner, you have another in your midst. Call him or her a black or a Chicano or a Latino or a Mexican. You know, you take the pick. For some, the other is a white person or a Jew or a Christian or a Muslim. We're afraid of the other. It's normal human nature. We don't know what he or her is thinking, what they want to do to us, what they have in mind. And the truth is, in the Torah, we're told that the Egyptians were afraid of the Israelites. They thought they would multiply and try and take over the country. And everything they did to us, says the Torah says, was out of fear. And it's understandable. So what that means is, in order to be able to fulfill all the nice things we talked about until now, we're going to have to learn how to overcome fear. And I think, and I'll just hint that I already on the screen kind of hinted to one of the ways of doing that. And it is turning the unfamiliar other into the familiar other. It's getting to know your other. Meeting, dialogue, connection, friendship. So that's the first stumbling block, fear of the unfamiliar other. Then comes a second stumbling block, trauma. Psychologists have taught me that wounded people wound people. If you've suffered sexual abuse as a child, if you've suffered physical abuse as a child, there's a much higher chance that you'll pay it forward, that you'll do that to your children and to the people you come in contact with. Wounded people tend to wound people. That's trauma. And to bring it to what we're talking about today, we Jews in Egypt were wounded, psychologically wounded. We were hurt. We were persecuted. And we perpetrate that memory. Now we perpetrate that memory in order to create empathy. But the sad truth is that just as often as the memory of persecution in the past creates the desire to not behave like that in the future, it just as often creates the opposite. Creates a sense that I'm going to do to them what they did to me. I'm going to pay it forward. It's not conscious. It's very often unconscious, but trauma wounds us and we have a tendency to pay it forward in the negative sense. So what we find here, therefore, is not only this stumbling block that the psychological effect of trauma may tend to make it difficult for us to have empathy towards the other, but it may even be worse, that by embedding in our consciousness the memory of Egyptian persecution, we're actually re-traumatizing ourselves and making it more difficult to behave goodly, well towards the sojourner in our midst. So we have to be very, very careful here. We have to be careful to learn the right lessons from history, not to re-traumatize ourselves when we have our Passover Seder, not to become so deeply involved in what we suffered 3,000 years ago so that we feel we have to do the same thing to those we come in contact with today. So this is getting complicated. And I'm not a psychologist. I'm not coming with any answers yet. I'm just putting on the table all the problems we have to overcome, the stumbling blocks. The third stumbling block is the victim mentality. And it's related to trauma, but it's also a bit separate. Many times, someone who suffered badly has a sense that, these people who I live around today, they're not suffering. That's nothing compared to what happened to me. They don't deserve any consideration. They should just tough it out. I suffered, so they should suffer a little bit also. It'll be good for them. There's a victim mentality also that says to us, inside of us, that I don't have any responsibility to do good. I went through so much. I have no responsibility anymore. I'm gonna live how I live. Sometimes victimhood disempowers us. The sense of responsibility, of moral accountability is lost. We have to be very careful that we don't create within us, through our remembrance of Egyptian slavery, a sense of a victim who now the world owes us recompense. We don't owe the world anything. They owe us everything. We should just sit back and wait to be repaid for the evil they did to us. And fourthly, we have what I call the Stockholm Syndrome. Historians or anthropologists may tell me that I'm misusing the phrase. And if you want to write me in the chat that I'm misusing it, that's okay. What I mean is that it sometimes happens, and this is documented, that those who suffer, for example, hostages, sometimes develop an identification with their oppressor. And sometimes a desire to be like their oppressor. One expression of this, I read about a little about Black slaves 150 years ago in America. Not all of them, of course, a minority, who wanted freedom in order to become slaveholders. In order to have the same power that was held over them, they want to hold it over others. And we have to be very careful as Jews, as we remember what it's like to be slaves. We don't have the sense that we want our freedom in order to do to us what they did do, in order to do to others what was done to us. We want the power so we can exercise it over others. We want to lord it over others as was lord over us. We have to be careful that that doesn't happen. So what I've tried to do is point out here is it four? It's five. Oh, I didn't talk about vengeance. I apologize. Well, everyone knows what vengeance is. Our normal human emotion. That I want to get back at the Egyptians for what they did to us 3,000 years ago. And if I can't get back at the Egyptians, I'll get back at the modern Egyptians. Who are the modern Egyptians? I may say they're the Palestinians. I may say they're the Blacks. I may say that there are others.
Amalek.
Right? And that absolutely, well, that I have later down on the sheet, Ilana, but it applies here also.
Thank you.
So it turns out that this whole thing of remembering that we were slaves, so we know what it's like to be a slave. We know what it's like to be a sojourner, and we can behave better towards the others. We have to make sure we don't shoot ourselves in the foot psychologically. And I would say, therefore, that the Jewish tradition, as we remember the Egyptian experience, when we sit down to the Seder every year to remember, we perhaps have to add some psychological elements to our tradition to make sure that we're not going to fall into the pitfalls that I have here on the screen. And of course, the subtext here is that I'm afraid that we sometimes do fall into these traps, very much. Would anyone like to stop and make a comment before we go on? I see that John wrote something. Thank you.
John stepped out of the room, but I will, he said that it's important to think of the length of time and self-understanding of the population does not have a bearing on whether someone is a ger. The Israelites were sojourners for 400 years and were ger. And then he gave a more modern example of Greece being occupied by Turkey. And when they were freed, they memorialized their 400 years on their military uniforms. Here he comes. He can tell you in his own words.
And so I just was thinking that, you know, whether they think of themselves as a people who are occupied or they think of themselves as a sojourner who's come to live, I would say that the Greeks were sojourners among the Turkish for 400 years. Of course, I'm not sure it's exactly 400 years, but that's the number they use in their stories, and they memorialize it to today.
Thank you. Thank you. Relevant. Would anyone else like to make a comment?
The same can be said about blacks in America.
Right. They're seen as others, although it's been hundreds of years. Absolutely. Jews in America as well, at least until a few years ago. So the next difficulty, after we talk about psychological difficulties, are the theological difficulties. And what I'm about to claim here is that although Jewish thought and philosophy says all the things we talked about on how to behave, how we should behave towards the ger, towards the other, we have other tendencies and trends in Jewish philosophy and Jewish theology that may be at cross purposes with everything we talked about until now. The first statement I put here on the screen is a people that dwells alone. In Hebrew, Am Levadad Yishkon. We Jews say about ourselves that we are to be separate. We're meant to be separate. We don't want to assimilate into the larger population. The laws of keeping kosher, for example, help to keep us separate, and there are many other laws. You know, the ultra-Orthodox wear a different dress and speak a different language. They speak Yiddish, they wear black in order to separate themselves from the larger society. And that definitely grows out of this idea in Judaism of being separate. My point is that when you maintain a degree of separation, you will be that much prevented from having contact, close contact, deep contact with the other, with the ger, with the sojourner, and not having contact, not knowing him, will prevent us from creating the closeness and empathy that might help us to fulfill the commandments that we've been talking about, the commandments of proper relationship towards the other, the downtrodden. So I'm trying to point out a certain tension within Jewish theology. The idea of the chosen people, the next idea here, Am Nivchar, that the Jews are chosen. Now it's true that we believe that we're chosen for a purpose, chosen for responsibility. And part of that responsibility is everything we talked about today. Responsibility to behave better towards the other. However, as we all know, sometimes the chosenness idea creates a sense in Jews of superiority, a superiority complex. And that complex of superiority, together with the separateness that we talked about 1 minute ago, again, prevents very often, and certainly can continue to prevent, Jews from feeling solidarity and empathy for the other. Again, a second theological matter that seems to be at cross purposes to a certain degree with the idea of the solidarity with the ger. And the third theological stumbling block, theological difficulty, is what Ilana said 5 minutes ago, Amalek. We have a concept in Judaism that there's a certain historical people called Amalek that attacked us cruelly 3,000 years ago after we left Egypt. And the Torah commands us to remember what they did, to never forget, and to blot out their memory from history and from the face of the earth. That means there's a commandment to kill them, men, women, and children. Now, thankfully, Jewish literature tells us there are no more people of the seed of Amalek on earth. And that commandment to blot out their memory, to kill them, to commit genocide, is not operative. But still, there are many Jews and many Jewish thinkers who homiletically talk about reincarnations of Amalek. That the Christians are Amalek. The Crusaders 1,000 years ago were Amalek. That the Muslims were Amalek. That the Inquisitioners were Amalek. That the Chmelnytsky Cossacks were Amalek. That the Nazis were Amalek. And yes, we find today that the Palestinians are Amalek. And all of those, and some of those homiletical extensions of the idea of demonizing Amalek tend to spread out and to color the way we see all others, the way we see those who are not us. And there's this tendency among certain aspects of Jewish society to demonize all who aren't Jewish, all who are not like. And there's even a tendency among some Jews to demonize other Jews who aren't like us. And to call those Jews Amalek. There have been ultra-Orthodox Jews who call secular Jews Amalek, who demonize them. And of course, this demonization absolutely prevents the empathy that is necessary to fulfill this commandment of the proper understanding and relationship to the ger that we've been talking about. I'm just looking at the chat box. At this point, I'm not going to deal with all the with solutions. To me, what you ask is one of the central issues that we have to grapple with. We have tensions in Jewish life. All of life is about tension. It's balancing different tendencies, different rights, different truths, different goods. A lot to be said. Going back to the screen, the last matter I wrote in these theological difficulties is theo-historical determinism. Jewish suffering at the hands of the Gentiles is part of the divine plan. There are many Jews who feel that somehow it's part of Jewish fate to be persecuted.
B'chol dor v'dor.
Exactly. It's in the Haggadah, it says in every generation, they come to annihilate us. We say that on Passover night. And
we don't say that. We just say we have to feel that we were liberated as well.
What do you mean?
There's no sense of...
We do say, B'chol dor v'dor omdim aleinu l'chalotenu.
Oh, yeah, but okay.
And we also say shfor chamatcha.
Well, we'll get to that.
Yeah.
So it is true, and we should never deny history, that the Jewish people have been persecuted for thousands of years. For many Jews, all these persecutions are connected. For many Jews, all the persecutors are simply reiterations of the ancient Egyptians. And just like our suffering in Egypt was part of our divine plan, so for many Jews, every generation of suffering is part of a divine plan. It's supposed to be like that. It's the way we expect things to unfold. And therefore, persecution actually is very comforting to many Jews. This may not be conscious, but it's unconscious. When we find ourselves persecuted, we say, that's the world I know. It's a familiar world. God is working. Things are as they've always been. So we feel that we're in a familiar world. And when you expect others to persecute you, you don't at all see a place in your heart to behave towards them with empathy. How can I have empathy those who God has programmed to kill me? So many Jews think like that. And there is much in Jewish literature that supports that way of thinking. And I'll tell you that in many, many commentaries on the Haggadah, on the text we say at the Seder, these ways of thinking are brought down, and they're seen as part of what we're trying to pass on during the Seder ceremony. Pass on that sense that in every generation they come to kill us, and that's the way it's supposed to be. God will always save us, but to suffer is to be a Jew. And again, my point is that this way of thinking is at cross purposes or in tension with our efforts to fulfill all those 36 commandments in the Torah that say to have empathy and to behave properly towards the sojourner and even to love the sojourner. So these are tensions within Jewish thought. I'm not coming with solutions, but we have to be aware of them before we look for solutions. The last level of difficulty, I said there were three, is the socio-political. Not psychological, not theological, the socio-political. And this is one that I want to dwell upon. What I mean is the physical, political circumstances in which the Jewish people have found themselves for the past 2,000 years and continue to find themselves. I'll explain what I mean when I say continue to find themselves. I'll have to explain myself. So first, I mean that for 2,000 years, we've been in dispersion, what we call pizur, galut, exile. We've had a sense that we're in exile, and it's not just a sense, it's a physical reality. We haven't been in the land of Israel, we haven't been home. We've been in the lands of the world, of a dispersion, the four corners of the universe. Secondly, we've had a sense of political disempowerment. Not just a sense, we've been politically disempowered. We haven't had power, not economic, not political, not social. We've been at the mercy of the local or the national rulers. And there's also been continued persecution and anti-Semitism, of course. Now, why is all this important? I'm going to say something now very central and answer the question, why is all this important? Because of the following. All of the verses in which the Torah told us to behave properly towards the sojourner, all of those verses were making the assumption that the Jew lives in his or her land, in the land of Israel, and has political and social and economic power. The assumption was that we Jews are in charge. We have the money, we have the capital, we have the land, and we have the political power, and the other is at our mercy. The other is a sojourner who's come from Moab, or from Egypt, or from Edom, or in modern terms from Jordan or from Syria, or from Eritrea or from Nigeria, who's come to our land. And they have come to our land, the land of Israel. They don't have political power, they don't have social power, they don't have a social safety net, they don't have a bank account, they don't have friends, they don't have anything. They're at our mercy, and we should behave properly towards them. That's the assumption of all the verses we saw. That we have the power and the other is the other. And therefore, for the past almost 2,000 years, all of these verses that we learned about, these so beautiful verses, have really been irrelevant. Because for the past 2,000 years, we have been the other. And we said to ourselves, whether we said to ourselves when we're in Babylon, or whether we're in Northern Africa, whether we're in Italy or England or France or Poland or Spain, we said to ourselves, these verses don't apply. Because it's not that we have to behave nicely towards the other, but it's rather that the Muslims, the Christian have to behave nicely towards us because we are the other. That's the way it's been for 2,000 years. For 2,000 years, the Jewish people put all these verses on hold, and to a large degree, justifiably so. However, beginning with modernity, our circumstances have changed. Jews who live in America today are no longer the other. At least for the past 40 years, and certainly in the past 20 years, Jews in America are part of the mainstream. Jews today have money, they have political power, they've made it, and they're seen as part of the mainstream society. We're no longer the other, but others are the other. Now it's the blacks. Now it's the Latinos. Now it's the Asians who are the other in America. And for the first time in 2,000 years, Jews can fulfill these verses, these commandments. For the first time in 2,000 years, they are relevant, they're meaningful. And this, of course, is true, not just for Jews in America today, but for Jews in Israel. For Jews in Israel today, for the first time in 2,000 years, the verses have become relevant. They're really talking directly to us. We're in our land, we have the power, political, economic, social, and the other is the other. The other has become another. Whether it's Eritreans or whether it's Palestinians or whether it's Christians or whether it's Muslims, for the first time, these verses are literally relevant and meaningful. And what all this means is that we Jews have to undergo a switch in our minds. The mentality of the past 2,000 years was justified, but no longer. And it's not easy. It's not easy to change your mindset. Our Seder today, in my claim, our Passover Seder, our understanding of what it means to remember Egyptian slavery has to change. For the first time, we can really experience the Seder as, I would claim, it was meant to be experienced, as a society that is set in its land, is established, has political, economic power, and is looking out at the disadvantaged, the underprivileged, and saying, wow, that's where we were 3,000 years ago. Now we have to behave towards them in the fashion that our oppressors didn't behave towards us. So in a certain sense, what I'm saying is, we have to overcome the stumbling block of 2,000 years of Jewish tradition that trained us not to experience the Seder in the way it was meant to be experienced. 2,000 years of Jewish tradition that trained us to put all these beautiful verses of loving the stranger, loving the sojourner, to put them off for the future. That future has arrived today. And therefore, we have to re-understand what the purpose of the Passover Seder is. Comments?
I just have to excuse myself, Hanan. So thank you. Right.
Okay, should I just continue? I'm certainly willing to have people react.
No, it's beautiful.
But Rabbi, those verses are not in the Haggadah.
Ah, so I just tried to explain why I think they're not in the Haggadah. Because the Haggadah, the text for the Passover night, is primarily a result of the Jewish experience in exile. Thank you for saying that, Mary Beth.
So are you saying we should rewrite the Haggadah?
That's what I'm hinting.
Okay.
Thank you, Mary Beth, for making explicit what was implicit. I was planning to say that just in the last 10 minutes. But we're getting very close to the last 10 minutes, actually.
You know, can I say something?
Of course.
It's Judy. I just wanted to add that when we do at the Seder, when we take out the wine, when we say the makot, and we take the drops of wine, we always considered it, I always assumed everybody did it for the reason that we are trying to be empathetic and say we should not enjoy when others suffer, that notion of empathy. Well, now I have 3 daughters-in-law who are Sephardic Israeli, and you know what? They don't do it for that reason. And it occurred to me, I wonder if this is an Ashkenazic tradition. And I recently, because my daughters-in-law, who are lovely girls, one in particular is just really terrific, and I'm sure maybe you do this in your wife's family, Hanan, I don't know. They take the wine and water and then they put it in a bowl for each makkah and they throw it away. And I asked my daughter-in-law, why do you do this? We're always so proud that we take the wine out of the cup for each makkah. We are always talking about it, so we should not be happy. We should suffer. We should feel the pain of the Egyptians. And she said, no, we do it. We throw it out so that it shouldn't happen to us. So I recently read a very good article in the Torah.com that talked about it. And that is talk about reviving and refreshing our understanding this postmodern time. Apparently, the source for that in terms of a rabbi, it was in the late 1700s or early 1800s, an Ashkenazi rabbi. I don't remember which one. I'll send you the article later. And it was a renewed look at why we're doing that. So although the original reason might have been to talk about the glory of God and doing these makot, we were able to look at it again and say, no, let's go back to that empathy that is reflected in some books of the Bible, such as Yonah, the book of Yonah, when the Kikayon, I'm not going to go into that, or the notion of Shirat Hayam, when Miriam is reprimanded for doing the dancing. That is in the sources. But that's an example of a ritual that the reason for it might not be the same reason that we understand it today.
Yeah, things can always be interpreted and reinterpreted.
Right, and
But
that's right.
I'm not familiar with the custom that you mentioned, the Sephardi custom. I'm not familiar.
Oh, really? I was surprised at that. Yeah, that was it's a Moroccan.
Moroccan, okay. My wife is Persian, not Moroccan.
Okay, so this is my daughter-in-law is a Moroccan, and I love her very much.
Thank you for that. We're going to now go on to the next part of our presentation. This is called traditional recognition of the difficulty of fulfilling all the commandments we've been talking about, focusing on the psychological difficulty. We are going to ultimately look in this 10-minute section of our presentation at a thinker who was born about the year 1800 and lived until about 1854, Rabbi Mordechai Liner, from the Polish city of Izbich. He wrote a book, or his grandson wrote a book of his thought called the Mei Shiloach, the Flowing Waters. And as an introduction that we're going to see from this book, we have here a verse from the book of Exodus, chapter 14, verse 8. The end of the verse says, the children of Israel went out with a high hand. The Israelites, the children of Israel, left Egypt when God freed us with a high hand. The question is, what does that mean, a high hand? The translation of Yonatan, Targum Yonatan,
Onkelos.
Yeah. First Yonatan is an ancient translation of the Torah and into Aramaic, which is meant to also be an interpretation, expansive translation. And what it says is that the phrase high hand means with a raised hand overcoming the Egyptians. With a raised hand overcoming the Egyptians. And then we have another translation of the Torah, another ancient Aramaic translation, this one of Onkelos, Targum Onkelos, and he translates the phrase high hand differently. He doesn't say it means a raised hand overcoming the Egyptians, he just says it means heads held high. Heads held high. And what we want to talk about for the next 7 minutes is what's the difference between, on the one hand, raised hand overcoming the Egyptians, and on the other hand, heads held high. And our thinker that we're focusing on, Rabbi Mordechai Yosef Izbich, the Mei Shiloach, he says the following. The difference is the following. He says that high hand means not against others with pride and a feeling of superiority. Rather, they felt as free people without fear of any man. What I think this thinker is doing, Rabbi Mordechai Yosef, he is implicitly rejecting, criticizing and rejecting the interpretation of Yonatan and accepting the translation of Onkelos. In other words, he's telling us that when we see the phrase that the Israelites left Egypt with a high hand, do not interpret it as Yonatan interpreted it. It's not a raised hand overcoming the Egyptians. It's not about pride and a feeling of superiority. It is rather a free people without fear of any man, which is what Uncle said. Raised hand does not mean a fist of defiance. It doesn't mean a fist of defiance. It rather means heads held high, a sense that now I am free of the shackles of the Egyptians. Another way of phrasing what we just said is that the high hand should never be a matter of defining yourself in terms of the other. Rather, you should always define yourselves on your own terms. Because when attaining freedom becomes a matter of looking back at the past, at those who oppressed you, and filling yourself with a sense of indignation, or the need for revenge, or the sense of superiority, or the sense of getting back at them, all that is not freedom. When you define yourselves in terms of the other, you are still enslaved to the other. You're still beholden to the other. Your sense of self-worth is dependent upon the other. And it could very well be that our author here, the Rav Mordechai Yosef, is talking here about the pitfalls that we as Jews may experience as we try to re-experience our going from slavery to freedom. We have to be careful not to define ourselves in terms of where we're coming from, of what they did to us, but rather we have to define ourselves really as free men and women, which means to be free not just physically, but to be free mentally and psychologically from seeing ourselves through the eyes of the other and through the experience that we experienced. And all that is summed up very well by my friend and colleague and teacher, Rabbi Herzl Hafter, who is the one that introduced me to the writings of Rav Mordechai Yosef 15 years ago. And in an article that he wrote, he says as follows: there's a danger, I'm reading from the screen, there's a danger that the Israelites, because of the trauma of slavery, would not properly separate from the abusive environment in which they developed. It is very tempting to adopt the stance of victimhood and self-righteousness. Together, these characteristics seem to grant the moral high ground. However, adopting a posture of victimhood and allowing it to shape one's personality in the lens through which one views the world can be very destructive. Too often, the victim turns into the victimizer. The abused becomes the abuser. Undoubtedly, the Israelites suffered terrible injustices at the brutal hands of the Egyptian masters. However, to adopt the role as victim, when the post-slavery era did not justify it, would in a sense perpetuate the slavery. Their freedom would be no freedom at all. It would be slavery in a different form. Their experience would be oriented back towards their oppressors. It would be a reaction to Egypt.
Wow.
And the subtext of what my colleague and friend and teacher of Herzl Hafter is writing is that we Jews are still enslaved to the Egyptians. To this very day, we're enslaved to the Egyptians. We do have to remember, and we have to remember not just what the Egyptians did to us, but to what all our oppressors did to us. But we have to learn the right lesson from the memory and not the wrong lesson. We have to be very careful to learn the right lesson, not the wrong lesson. And it could be that for psychological and historical and sociological and theological reasons, we very often teach ourselves the wrong lesson. And that's not good.
In a way, it's a Stockholm symptom too.
Explain?
Well, because we identify with the oppressors instead of with our own self view.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So I'm just going to take a listen. I'm looking at I want to thank everyone for the comments in the chat box. I appreciate them. We're going to close. Time is short, of course. It always becomes short because I have a tendency, I guess, to be verbose. The problematics of the Passover Seder. I just listed here on the screen some elements of the Passover Seder that I think cause us to stumble in the things we've been talking about. One of them was mentioned by some of you in this class during the past hour and a half. It's here. In every generation, they tried to destroy us. We say that in the Passover Seder. Now, of course, it's not, in my opinion, it's not wrong to say it. What we're saying is true, that we've been persecuted again and again and again. But the question is, what do we say to ourselves when we say that? With what interpretation do we give it? And I'm afraid that very often we learn from that the wrong lesson as opposed to the right lesson. Number two, in the Passover Seder, we have a statement that says, Lavan attempted to destroy everything. And for those who know it well, for those who don't, I'm not going to take time to go into it. But the Seder says that Lavan, who was the father-in-law of Jacob, our forefather, was a precursor of the Egyptians, and he persecuted Jacob just as, or even worse, than the Egyptians later persecuted us. And it's part of a stream of thought, in my opinion, of seeing enemies under every rock and at every bend in the road. We have our enemies, but I believe we've adopted this victim mentality in which we see enemies everywhere, even where perhaps we should not be seeing them. And I think that that's very problematic. Thirdly, in the Haggadah, we have a point at which I say there weren't just 10 plagues against the Egyptians, there were actually 40, there were actually 50, there were actually 250. And I think that some of us, when we read that, we see it in terms of revenge. We are multiplying the plagues with a sense of, we gave it to them. And it reminds us that we can and we should give it to all our enemies in every generation. Suggesting this part of the Seder is unnecessary, and perhaps it is counterproductive. Lastly, there is what Ilana mentioned, pour your wrath upon the nations that do not acknowledge it. That's part of the Seder. Someone has to mute themselves. I'm not sure where it's coming from. You have to mute everyone at this point. Okay, I unmuted everyone. I muted everyone. If you want to speak, you can unmute yourselves. Okay, so that part of the Seder I think is problematic, extremely problematic. And the last thing I have in the sheet is the lakona. Lakona means what's missing. In my opinion, I think that the center, what should be the center, the focal point of the Seder is missing, which is, why are we doing this? Why are we remembering that we were slaves and we were brought to freedom? It's everything we talked about in the verses of the Torah in the first half hour of this presentation. They're missing from the Seder. So again, as I said, I think there are good historical reasons why they're missing, because of 2,000 years of exile and dispersion and persecution, in which they were irrelevant. But today they are relevant, and today I think they should be brought back into the Seder. So now, in the last 5 or 10 minutes, I'm just going to make some suggestions how we can add to the Seder in this generation in order to make it more relevant and more meaningful and more authentic, in my opinion, to the original intention of the Torah. One thing we can do, and this is kind of an introduction, is remember that the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel actually was meant to set a course for a new Jewish mentality. And I just want to read a few sentences from the Declaration of Independence. And I'll first tell you that my teacher, Rabbi Yehuda Amital, saw the Israeli Declaration of Independence, a document that was accepted by the Jewish people, as morally and legally binding upon every Jew. He saw it as a halachic, a legally binding text that obligates us. And what we have in the second paragraph that I quoted, perhaps someone could read it because I cry when I read it. Can someone read it for me? Unmute yourself and read it. Please. John, can you read it, Shoshana?
John's going to read it.
The state of Israel will be open for Jewish immigration and for the ingathering of the exiles. It will foster the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants. It will be based on freedom, justice, and peace as envisioned by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. It will safeguard the holy places of all religions, and it will be faithful to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations.
Thank you. So I believe that that is a charter for the Jewish people. And it's a charter that means we have to reimagine what it means to be a Jew. It means seeing yourself as a Jew, as a member of the majority culture that has a responsibility to the minority culture. That's a new Jewish mentality. And the Seder, I think, should reflect that new Jewish mentality in accordance with everything we've said for the past hour and a half. So how to do that? It's a big endeavor. It's not just about adding to the Seder, it's about a switch in the Jewish mentalities. We talked about in this presentation, it's about 365 days a year. But just to focus on the Seder for a moment, the first thing I wrote is concerning in every generation, they tried to destroy us. That can be deleted from the Seder. I'm not in favor of deleting it, but I am in favor of discussing it and putting it in the proper context in light of everything we talked about. As far as the matter of Lavan attempted to destroy everything, I am in favor of deleting that from the Seder. I am in favor of deleting from the Seder, I guess I forgot to write it, all the matter we saw about the 250 plagues. I'm in favor of deleting that. And now to focus on what's now on the screen. This is a long story, I'll make it short. The original blueprint for the Passover Seder is found in a text called the Mishnah from about 1,800 years ago. And it tells us that when we tell the story of slavery to freedom on this night at the Seder, we should tell the story based on 5 verses in the book of Deuteronomy. And indeed, for the past 1,800 years, we Jews have been doing what we've been told. We've been basing the story that we tell on the Passover night on those verses in Deuteronomy. But we've been leaving out the 5th of those verses. The 5th verse is missing from the Haggadah. Historically, we've never found an ancient Haggadah that has that 5th verse. But again, the blueprint for the Seder in the text called the Mishnah tells us to include the 5th verse. What does the 5th verse say? It says, he brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Today, and in all Haggadot we know, we end the story by saying that God freed us from slavery. But we don't mention that he brought us into the land of Israel. And there are some rabbis who think that the reason we don't have that verse in our Haggadah is because it wasn't relevant for the past 1,800 years. We weren't in our land. Why should we say that God brought us into the land? Because in the meanwhile, we've been exiled from the land. But the claim of many modern rabbis is that now that the Jewish people are back in the land, we should reintroduce that verse into our Haggadah. And we should add into the story not just that God brought us from slavery to freedom, but that he also brought us to the land of Israel. And my claim is that indeed we should do that. We should bring that verse back into the Haggadah. Khalid wants to tell me something.
כן, כן, הנוער מחכים, שיזמינו פגישה אחרת או שמתי אנחנו מסיימים את הפגישה פה?
בשעה 7 אמרו לי שמתחילים עם הנוער.
אתה איתנו, אבל ב6:30 מתחילים.
אף אחד לא אמר לי 6:30, אמרו לי 7.
7 זה אתה ב7. אתה מצטרף לפגישה ב7.
ואתה מתכוון שצריכים את הזום.
כן, כן, כן.
לא ידעתי, אז בעוד 5 דקות אני אגמור.
אוקיי, 5 דקות.
Okay.
אוקיי, אז 5 דקות.
I was just told that this news channel is needed by others, so we'll have to end in 5 minutes. I just want to point out that when we add that extra verse to the Haggadah, what we're doing is we're saying that we're now in our land, we're now the majority culture, and it's now time to fulfill all the commandments about proper behavior towards the sojourner that we read about in the Torah. I also mention here verses from the Bracha that can be added into the Seder, and I also mention that there are replacements for pour out your wrath, shefok hamatcha, in order again to not completely destroy the Seder we have today, but to add to it, to make certain changes in order to make it more relevant and meaningful to all the things we talked about today. So I don't have time to have people comment. I'm happy for everyone to write to me by email your comments, your objections, your additions. Anyone who wants the source sheet and doesn't have it can certainly write to me. My email, as you hope all know, is ravhanan@gmail.com. And thank you for joining us. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
So much.
It's wonderful. Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
You.
Hey, how do we turn this off? Thank you again for joining us.